the things I would hope for you and hope for the institution, because I never see them as separate things. When you become a member of the Iliff community, we really want you to bring your expertise and your experience through the door with you. I think sometimes people frame that this is going to be a new part of their lives, and they sort of try to leave things behind. It's been my experience that the Iliff community is enriched deeply when you bring your experience with you through the door, and you live in that experience as well as garnering new experience. So please, everything that you have done in your life is valuable in this community. It helps us understand the world in deeper ways. So please do not check your identity at the door. Do not check your experiences at the door. Please bring them into the whole space with you, because so much learning takes place between classrooms as well as in classrooms. So please do that. We welcome that. We hope for it. And so we want you to know that we do. Also, find that faculty member that you really resonate with, and build a lifelong relationship with that individual. My theological school mentor is gone. He's no longer living. But at my college, one of my college professors who I loved and maintained a lifelong relationship also is gone, but I still have one left. I still value that. Late in career, I still value that. Find that person, because this is not just a moment in your life where you're going to enter and you're going to complete a degree and then you're going to move on. Iliff goes with you. Take Iliff with you, and Iliff will stay with you as well. We see this as a lifelong relationship. There will be moments, tough moments, and we don't make apologies for that either, by the way, where we're going to ask you to deal with your privilege and your identity in the context of the whole world. And there will be moments that's very, very uncomfortable. When it is, and it will be, we ask you, and we will stand with you in that, by the way. We just won't protect you from it. We will stand with you in it, but we won't protect you from it. But what I would ask is this: when it's really, when it becomes threatening, when it becomes, the uncomfortable, take a moment and pause. Take a breath. And then I'm going to ask you to imagine the people that you've come here to prepare to serve. Diverse communities of people that you will serve. And I want you to imagine that community. And then in the context of doing this work, I want you to walk closer to it. Take a step closer to it. Because the reality is that the world needs you to have done. Those communities, the people you're going to work with, the world, are going to need you to have done this work. And it doesn't take very long to read headlines to know where that work isn't happening or where that work is needed. So know that what you are doing is critical to the world and communities of people who are feeling disenfranchised. And to know yourself in the context of how you are perceived when you enter those communities is critically important. So we do that work, and we stand with you in that work. And just so you know, this institution has made a commitment to becoming an ever-deepening place of humility. Not cultural competency, but humility. Competency is check the box and say, oh yeah, we've arrived. We've done that work. No, cultural humility is where we make a vow for our lives, for our institution, for our individual lives in the institution, to make that commitment for life. And to see as a lifelong journey. Our board is doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Our faculty are doing, and Boyan can say more about that, and our staff do diversity and equity inclusion. So we have the same experience that we expect our students. We join you in that. It's a part of a fabric of this institution. And it's not perfect. This institution is not perfect. And we recognize that because we're not immune from the pressures that any other institution is immune from. But it makes a difference when we start with the understanding that we're not immune. It's a different set point. So we're excited to see you, and we're excited for the possibility to share life with you, and to learn from you, and as you bring yourself to this community, and for you to experience the power of this community. So this is not a commercial announcement. This is just real conversation, and if it fits for you, know that you're welcome here. Just know that. So I'm glad to see you, and welcome to Iliff. Boyoung.
Thank you, Tom. You know, everything that Tom said, I echo, and I think that's why I am here to work with him. Not only I moved from the institution where Daniel went and where Tom went, because there's a lot of the similar commitments and resonance. Often people ask me, why did you move from Berkeley to Denver? And I was a professor at the seminary in Berkeley for 15 years, and I'm finishing my 4th year as a dean here. So when I answer that, there are multiple ways, but and I often say that I have been watching Iliff for a long time, and I want to be part of this innovative and social justice committee, the school that is not compromising its identity. So as I said earlier in my initial introduction, I come from Korea, and during 80s and early until 1991, the only 2 mainline denominations that ordained the women, one Presbyterian, one Methodist. And I'm a Methodist, but I didn't know that Methodist until I was serious about answering God's call to be an ordained minister. I didn't know that there is a rule in Korean Methodist Church that unlike men, women had to be single for the rest of their life. And so, we all have these interruption stories, but when circumstances are, not in favor of what we think, right? So we tend to postpone, and we don't know, maybe it'll come later. So, and I was at the moment that I couldn't even wait, so I had to leave home. And similarly, that why I am at Iliff. As we all go through this pandemic era and all of the things happening in our world. Compared to only last year, we live in dramatically different world. So world is so rapidly changing, and theology has so much to offer. But somehow, along the way, some people studied losing interest in religion and theology in a variety of reasons. And so while I was doing in being in theological education, I was longing for being part of an institution that is not always hit the drum after the fact, but charting the path. And so I was watching what is going on in Iliff, because Iliff was the first mainline theological school that studied online education in 2010, and Association of Theological Schools that accredited all theological schools based on, developed their standard based on what's going on at Iliff for online education. So our faculty is doing really well. And also, as Tom mentioned, commitment to social justice, especially racial and gender equity and equality justice, is very important at Iliff. So we have, even though this is one of the 13 United Methodist schools, we have 1/3 of our students who are not Christians, and also 1/3 of our students who identify as LGBTQIA plus community members. And now, and so doing that work continually, now we also, as Tom mentioned, that this is a year 2 that Iliff faculty is going through mandatory diversity training. Our faculty, 50% of our faculty are faculty of color. It's one of the top 5 students, top 5 schools at association that has the most faculty diversity, but this faculty is still committed to go through this process. So not only we know critical race theory and this and how what we do in our own classrooms, but we want to build the culture among ourselves that is based on what Tom said, the culture of humility, that we embody that. So we not only teach through content, but we also teach through our relationships with one another and also with our students. So that's what we are doing. And then our staff went through mandatory training. And then this year, they are also going through, the self-paced training themselves. And our board is going through that training very seriously. And one of the, first courses, if you're master students, that you have to go through that Iliff is that identity, power, and vocation in community that is based on the, critical reflections on our identity and difference, and especially justice and our gender and racial, cultural, class identity, and how it forms and informs and transforms us as leaders. So through that lens, we want you to experience Iliff's education as you go through. And so these are some of the, the commitments. So based on this deep foundational commitments to just the word, that this faculty and staff have been very innovative. So we are the only school that Artificial Intelligence Institute at a theological school that we are even consulting Silicon Valley people, because they talk about ethics, but when they talk about ethics, there is no concept of spirituality or what it means to be human in the age of artificial intelligence, what it means to be a care provider in the age of artificial intelligence. So we bring those gap conversations to Silicon Valley and we consult them. Also, we have a Center for Equal Justice that is focused on environmental racism, because minoritized communities are the most impacted communities by climate change, all these racial environmental injustices. So we, first a conference that brought all kinds of people from all kinds of religious and secular backgrounds, including former governor of Colorado and law professor, Michigan Flint activist, and they all came. And our book came out on, kept coming out in April 1st, but it is already one of the top 10, number 2 books in environmental justice work. It is listed. And so these innovative things are only possible because our faculty and staff are not confined in the traditional model, but we always think, how do we make a theology a leading voice to frame what's going on in our world and provide the new lens and new perspectives on what's going on in the world. So we think about that rather than hit the drum. Oh yes, we have to do this, or okay, we are doing this. So these are some of the reasons why I came to Iliff, because I want to part of this leading voice, not hitting the drum movements after the fact. So this is a very friendly school, very intimate school, and our faculty is very friendly and accessible. And even this Saturday, you will see some of them. And so, as Tom emphasized, and I hope that you build a relationship with them, but also build a relationship with one another, because that's what carries you over, and you are the ones that together who build the new voices, create something different from same old. So together we are doing this work, and so I hope that you will have those opportunities. You give those opportunities to yourself to experience this good education, good people yourself. So welcome.
Thank you, Tom and Boy Young. We are running a little bit ahead of schedule. With that said, I know, I wonder, Tom and Boy Young, would you be willing to take perhaps a few questions from prospective students before we transition to our faculty panel?
Always.
Sure.
Great.
I guess I'll ask the question. Again, I'm Matt, and I have talked with former Iliff graduates, and and they talk about the Journey program as being somehow an extraordinarily bonding experience. That they talk about the community that has been developed online as being something that's really quite extraordinary. And I wonder, how do you all do that when so many of us think of online education as being less personal and less community oriented?
Yeah. Well, Young, do you want to take that?
Yes, and also, see students, if you want to chime in, please do so. I think, because our instructors design their classes in a very interactive way. So often people tend to think the online education is like a MOOC program that the mass people sign up for class and then get the, contents they need. But over the years, our faculty learned that that's not a good pedagogical model. So, our faculty is very good at designing class that both the synchronous and asynchronous ways. And then the courses are designed in a very interactive way. Like, in this screen, we have Dr. Eric Smith, who teaches the New Testament and early Christian history and also direct them in. So he is one of the really excellent online teachers who gets almost 5.0 score every year in his teaching evaluations. And I know that as once I have seen how he teaches to learn how I left away my first year. So throughout the week, students interact with one another, and they also interact with the faculty. And so each faculty has their own unique way of designing class, but that's really bottom line of how we teach. But also because the students interact with one another a lot in the class, they are very eager to meet those people they see on screen or a small thing and in writing in person. So whenever we have gathering days, we are on a quarter system. So every fifth week of the quarter, a student, not during the pandemic time, come back to campus. And then we have, like a first year students retreat, day-long retreat on Thursday, those days. And then a lot of community building events and meal times and school events. And so they find each other, and then also usually second year on or second quarter on as a Journey students, they either rent Airbnb together. And some, I often also see that some of our students have their life partners join at the end of their gathering days, so they even take a vacations together. So I think a school can, only do certain thing, but I think somehow, we are giving some platforms for them to get to know each other, eager to meet each other, and then when that platform is there, just they are eager to build those relationships and continue.
I've had the experience of being in the hallway at the beginning of gathering days. Gathering days is the 5th week of every term. And we didn't get it this year because of COVID, but we're coming back to it. And where I'm literally watching students walk through the door 5 weeks into the term, and they're meeting their cohorts on the same ground for the first time. And they know each other, and the warmth and the embrace with each other it's just unbelievable. And so it's been fun. And then we like to have students for dinner in our house, my wife and I. By the way, I'm married to somebody who's also ordained, but also she has an MSW. So she's got an MDiv and an MSW. So Brooks, was that you that was interested in the MSW? Yeah. When she saw Ilif's joint as a dual program, she said, "Where was that when I was in seminary?" But anyway, she and I like to host students for dinner, and so we hear the relationship building process from the students themselves. So.
Any other questions? Let's see. There is a comment from Adrian in the chat, approximately how many students attend Iliff School of Theology?
Right now, we have about 215 master students attending. And they are coming from 46 different states. We have a lot of students actually from Texas and Florida and Oklahoma and outside of Denver, yeah.
Yeah.
Adrian also is asking, what are the biggest challenges you see with your students?
Right now, with the pandemics, because everyone is stretched, and so job and some students struggle with their children, students with their children attending school online at home, and then their partner works at home and they work at home and then they go to school. So those things are one of the challenges, and some other, I think even before pandemic, I think the student work and life, work and school balance has been one of the struggles, but nothing like this pandemic time. But maybe, see as a student, current student, what do you say that what you hear from your peers?
I guess it would be similar to what you said of just having everything online and then having other things happening in your life outside of school, whether it being work or family, in connection to everything being online and everything taking place in the same spot.
Yeah, we have a student service team which made of like a faculty and staff who are what I call frontline people working with the students meet every week to come up with a support plan if we identify our student need a support. So our academic advisors are always in touch with their student constantly. And so we try to provide customized support if possible, and so so that the students do not end up in bigger crisis. So we have those meetings on a weekly basis, and we have a professional academic advisors, as you met Jeremy earlier, who has experience in higher education as instructor, but also both of them have a PhD. Jeremy in constructive theology and Samantha Zhu and in Hebrew Bible. So they understand the dynamics of these, and then they also activism work. So we try to come up with support that we can provide as much as we can through those connections.
One of the things that we weren't sure as the pandemic unfolded, nobody was really clear about the timeline and how long it was going to impact us. And when it became clear that this was not going to be a short-term thing, our advancement office went to work and created an opportunity for our donors to give to a student emergency fund. Mm-hmm. So that's now wired into our system. That's not just COVID related. That's going to go with us into the future. And so that students who found themselves in financial stress could apply to that for some additional support.
Mm-hmm. I saw one more question from Sam. How many of our students work full time? Especially junior students, I would say majority of our students have a full time job. So they work full time, they go to school full time, and many of them are doing really well in both areas. So we have a lot of second and third career students with amazing careers, and as Stephanie earlier said, lawyers and a lot of social workers coming to Iliff too. And then we have several medical doctors, including medical school dean in our current MD program. And so these people, and as Tom earlier mentioned, the interruption stories, that they have had those interruption stories for many, many years. And finally, they're doing that while working full time. So many students have a very busy schedule as a full-time job, but that they also find that going to full-time school at the same time is doable.
One of my favorite stories is one of our alums now, when he was a student at Iliff. He's an Air Force pilot, and then he became a FedEx pilot. So he was a cargo hauler flying a 777 all over the world. So every week he would have been in Japan or some other place delivering. And so he had these long hauls of time where he was on autopilot with a crew with him. And he would love to tell the story of pulling out a theology book for his assignment and sitting in the left seat of a 777 and listening and reading theology. And he was a great student, by the way.
That's a great example, Tom. Thank you both for fielding some burgeoning questions from our students. I see that our esteemed faculty have logged in. And so with this said, Tom, I know usually this part of the program you leave us, but are there any parting words that you'd like to, or words of wisdom that you'd like to share with our students before you depart?
Don't pressure me with wisdom, please, but just know that you are in really good hands for the rest of the way. And thanks for thinking about Iliff, and enjoy the rest of the time. Just give yourself to this, and people will give themselves to you. So you are in for a nice journey today. Be well, everyone. Be well.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, looks like most folks have submitted their responses. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Boyan, to lead us off in the faculty panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, joining us on this Saturday. And by the way, Monday is Iliff's bonus day for faculty and staff to honor their tireless work. So this is a long weekend, but they are breaking out of that. So thank you so much. So I want to invite each of you to introduce who you are and what you teach here first. So let me invite Eric first, since according to my screen.
I think all of you, or most of you, were here earlier when I introduced myself, but my name is Eric Smith, and I teach New Testament and the history of Christianity. This is the end of my 7th year on the faculty at Iliff.
Tell us some of the course titles that you teach.
Yeah, so I teach a lot of the intro to the history of Christianity, intro to the New Testament kinds of classes, but recently I've taught a class on Jewish-Christian relations in antiquity. I taught a class this past fall called Queering Early Christianity, which takes queer theory and puts it in conversation with New Testament and other early Christian texts, which was a lot of fun. I teach classes on the exegesis of the Gospel of John, exegesis of Matthew, and I like to I like coming up with new class ideas. It's a lot of fun to explore some of these topics, and often the place those come from are the interest of students. So students are the ones who say, it'd be really cool to have a class in this, and that's the germ of something that we dive into deeper later.
And also, he teaches the Doctoral Ministry Prophetic Leadership Foundational Seminar. Okay, Dr. Doring. Yeah, Dr. Doring. Carrie.
Hi, I'm Carrie Doring. I direct the Masters of Arts in Pastoral and Spiritual Care at Iliff, which is our degree that prepares people for chaplaincy and spiritual care vocations in communities of faith and nonprofit. And I'm ordained in the Presbyterian Church and a licensed psychologist. I teach courses on spiritual care, and this quarter teaching a course on moral stress, resilience, and spiritual integration. And last quarter taught a course on ministry and sexuality.
And Carrie is one of the leading scholars in moral injury studies internationally, and her textbook how many languages it's translated into?
I'm not sure. Korean, I know that. It is in Korean.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Unju Kim, Unju.
Hello, I am Unju Kim. I teach preaching and worship courses. And this is my, how many years? 20 something years, because I began to teach at Iliff in the academic year of 1998. These days, I teach several new courses like prophetic ministries and
Public speaking.
Yeah, public speaking and weddings and funeral practices. And my traditional courses are introduction to Christian worship and preaching in Christian communities. And the last quarter, I taught preaching and spiritual leadership. That I'm going to use it as a sample class after this session. And this quarter, I teach worship in multicultural contexts and practical theology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Dr. Kim's worship in multicultural context, which also she has written book, is widely regarded a book because the often worship class book textbooks are written in very white middle class context. So these are some of the works that she is charting in the academy. So these are three faculty who is also known among our students as some of the best teachers that we have. And I meet with them through annual evaluation. I met with each of these colleagues already this year, and their course evaluations is outside of the chart. So so as a faculty, you know that we live in a very different world. Even without pandemic, the world is changing so rapidly in so many new ways that we didn't think about. So in this kind of a world, and also given that that pandemic time we are going through, what do you think how theological education can help local, regional, national, and global communities create some solutions to this unknowns of our world, and why people need to even consider theological education during these challenging times? So I guess it is related to why theology matters to you and why people should take theology seriously.
Well, I could go first. I do workshops and training events on how to practice spiritual self-care during a pandemic. So I'm starting a series of workshops in at New York Presbyterian healthcare system that will help frontline workers find ways to interrupt their chronic stress responses, and through calming practices that can become spiritual when people connect with a sense of goodness. And then the workshops are also designed to help people learn how to have conversations with each other about the moral stress of COVID-19 stress for frontline workers, the most basic conflict between care of self and care of patients, and also racism. So how frontline workers deal with the moral stress of patients being racist towards them or witnessing staff interactions that are microaggressions. And so there's tremendous potential for spiritual care to alleviate stress and help people search for these underlying conflicts and values that make stress so profoundly disturbing. But there's also a liability when people draw upon religious resources for that to harm them, especially if they're experiencing a sense of God judging them. So there's complex research about when spirituality and religion helps people in stress and trauma and when it harms them. And we try to use all that to explore the unique ways that spiritual care can help.
Thank you. Such important work. And Carrie, can you give us one sentence or two sentence definition of what moral injury is? Maybe, to some people it's new.
Yeah, moral stress was first researched among nurses. Moral injury emerged from working with veterans whose trauma, particularly combat trauma, was compounded by shame, anger, and a sense of betrayal, either for the harm they caused or the harm that was caused, particularly by a betrayal in leadership. And these concepts of moral stress and moral injury are now being used a lot to talk about pandemic, that we've all experienced these kind of conflicts in values, particularly around, protecting life, doing no harm. But then also freedom, what freedom means in the United States. So very complex moral issues around this. And there's a lot of good research on how to understand all that.
Thank you. Thank you. Eric or Anju, your answer to my original question, why theology matters? You're muted, Anju. Still muted. Okay,
You hear
now.
me? Okay,
Yes.
sorry. Sometimes I do that. Well, I think our pandemic situation makes us think deeply about what human beings are and what human communities and global communities are. So our condition makes us think many theological questions. As we know, many people have died of this disease, and perhaps some of us in our congregation or in our society will think why these bad things happen to good people. So this is a theodicy issue. We call it the doctrine of theodicy. And some people might be very concerned about the future of the global human community. Perhaps this pandemic would not be the only case. Maybe in the future, we might have more. So this situation makes us very, the feeling fear and anxious. So they might raise theological questions about, our future, particularly our children's future, our ecological crisis, and the brokenness of human relationships, cause lots of harms to our nature and our human society. Then how can we prepare a better future? Then these questions relate to theological questions. And the Iliff and other theological seminaries are responsible for responding to these questions. And then also, we hear almost every day from the news and the social media about injustice and inequality. In other words, the issues of justice and equity and inclusion. To handle our pandemic situations, particularly, the vaccinations and unemployment benefits and the other social and personal issues. Then these situations also raise theological questions like, what does justice mean? How can we bring equity to the members of our communities? So these are theological questions. And then in relation to my specialties of preaching and worship, the pandemic situation makes most pastors and preachers and worship leaders think about how their online preaching and worship can be more effective to provide spiritual space for their congregations to reflect on those issues that I already mentioned and provide a kind of peaceful and meaningful and memorable moments. So online preaching and worship are a sort of theological issue and also a practical issue.
Thank you so much. It's so powerful. Dr. Smith, Eric, why people need to know New Testament? Why bother?
Well, I really resonate a lot with what Dr. Kim was just saying. We do live in this moment where there are so many profound questions, where there's been this sort of grand interruption into the way that the world has always worked. And suddenly we're faced with these questions about why does it work this way? Does it have to work this way? Is it good that it happens this way? Is it fair? Is it just? And my hunch about all of you is that if you have found your way to a Zoom call on a Saturday about theological education, is that you already have a hunch that that it's worth asking these questions. There are other things you could be doing with your time right now, but you have a sense that there's something important to talk about there. And earlier, someone asked, you know, how do you create that sense of community in an online class? And I think the other part of the answer that we didn't talk about is there's just something so powerful about being part of a community of people who all have the same kinds of things in mind. So when you get into a class, whether it's New Testament or pastoral and spiritual care or preaching and worship or something else, when you get into a class with people who all, you know, come from different places and different backgrounds and different experiences, but all have something in common about the questions that they're asking about the world, there's something really intensely powerful about that. And there's the content, you know, of the class that you're talking about, you know, maybe New Testament or something like that. But there's a lot more to it than that. There's this sense of working through these big questions in a community that I think is more important now than it has been for most of my life. It seems like these questions have really been brought into focus through the pandemic and through not only the pandemic, but also, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement of last summer. You know, the recent seems like restart of our gun violence epidemic that was on hiatus for a little while, but here we are again, back to violence against people of color, violence against women. So, you know, if you're here, I think you already have a sense that these are things worth thinking about. And I think Iliff for me has been a really fantastic place to think about these things.
Thank you. So all three colleagues, yours, you know, not only talked about why theology matters from your expertise perspectives, but all of you also framed that through the lens of justice and equity and diversity and inclusion. So can you say more about some of the specific foundations of knowledge that you teach, or you try to embody, you try to help our students embody through learning from you in your classes? How, you know, so what are some of the respective perspectives that you provide to support the community engagement and social justice and equity, diversity, inclusion in your own particular classes? And Unju already mentioned that.
I can start off. The approach we teach at Iliff that prepares people for chaplaincy and spiritual care is a socially just, interreligious, evidence-based approach to spiritual care. And the socially just approach to spiritual care we use really looks at persons in communities and how different aspects of our identities, like our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our racial identity, interact from one moment to the next to give us privilege or not. And this really shapes how people cope with stress, what resources they have access to, and then how prejudice and discrimination compound stress. And the amazing thing about teaching us a spiritually just orientation to spiritual care at Iliff is that orientation is across the curriculum. We also teach an interreligious approach, which means that in terms of spiritual care, if I were listening to your story of COVID stress, I would try to step into your world and understand your unique values, beliefs, and practices. I have my own values and beliefs and practices, but I need to have this capacity for spiritual self-differentiation to separate my values and beliefs from yours and respect yours as true for you and always as mystery. And so many seminaries who teach pastoral care teach it out of their own religious tradition, which then unfortunately can form chaplains and religious leaders that believe that in order to be saved, you have to conform to their beliefs and practices. Iliff, I think, is kind of unique and unusual in using this interreligious approach across the whole curriculum. And that makes our graduates really well prepared to go out into the world and provide care that really respects religious difference.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So just the anecdote, one of the surprises that I had at Iliff was how military chaplains love Iliff, and we keep getting visits from Air Force and Army and Navy military chaplains to recruit our students, because they are mostly more conservative people than us, but they find Iliff graduate chaplains in military can work well with all kinds of people with all kinds of religious backgrounds because of this training. So that was a really big, pleasant surprise to me. Unju or Eric, who want? Unju, you're muted again.
Many people think that preaching and worship are just personal. In other words, through preaching, the congregation or listeners are supposed to be converted or spiritually grow at their personal, moral, and spiritual levels. However, the history of Christian preaching, particularly rooted in the prophetic preaching, so lots of prophets, including Jesus in the Bible, are concerned about the social transformation. So justice, equity, inclusion, all these are the main theological issues and main human issues. And preachers and worship leaders should think about those things. And then we should be sensitive to what's going on in our society and who are in the center of our society and who are in power and who are marginalized and who are on the margins of society and suffer in all the social sectors. So to preach and to prepare worship mean that how we can encourage our congregations recognize all these social issues and where is God? In other words, where can we find Jesus in our contemporary context. So in my preaching and worship classes, I all the time emphasize that our personal conversion is not separated from social transformation. And then also the social transformation is also very strongly affected or affect, the personal lives. So personal and social are not separated. So we need to have this kind of double, foresight when we prepare our sermons and our worship services.
Thank you so much. I think Dr. Kim is also ordained the PCUSA clergy, but I think she just preached the wonderful Wesleyan social holiness gospel. So Eric, many of us, especially feminist theologians, have been saying the Bible has been both bread and stone. It has been life-giving, but it was most harming thing in many people's lives. So how do you bring more bread point than stone in your New Testament classes?
I love that way of framing it, because there is that history of the way that the Bible has been used. So one of the really rewarding things and one of the really frightening things about biblical studies is just how much is at stake. Whether we like it or not, the Bible has tremendous influence in our culture and even our government and the kinds of laws that get passed. It's super consequential. So the question is not, whether we read the Bible. It's a question of how the Bible is interpreted and read and mediated to the world. So I think the question of how to have more bread than stone is at the heart of what we do in a class at Iliff. I'll talk maybe just about that class I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Queering Early Christianity class. That's a class I think that starts, from a really different place than a lot of Bible classes, in that it starts by asking, how do we center the experiences and the readings and the insights from queer persons, people who identify as queer, when reading the New Testament. And that produces, as it turns out, super useful and fascinating readings, both for the people doing the readings, but also for people who don't identify as queer. It provides insights into this text and liberating readings of the text that would not have been accessible otherwise. One of my favorite stories, to kind of switch registers for a second, one of my favorite stories about the Bible comes from the grandmother of Howard Thurman, who famously refused to hear anything from the Apostle Paul because she had been born enslaved on a plantation in Florida, and the owner of the plantation would send in a minister to preach Paul, well, pseudo Paul, from Ephesians and 1 Timothy, slaves obey your masters. And so she had heard that enough times that in her old age, she had said, I'm not going to hear it anymore. I don't want that stone thrown at me anymore. And I think that's a legitimate reaction. That's understandable. That's a just reaction to the way the Bible has been leveraged. But there's also the question of how do you make bread out of it? How do you interpret it in a way that brings life and not death? And so I see those as sort of, the two tasks at a place like Iliff, recognizing the harm, mitigating the harm, but also trying to read this text in life-giving ways.
Thank you. I'm not a Bible scholar, but one of my expertise is a biblical pedagogy, how to teach the Bible in just a way. And so I teach, the one of the making the stone into bread is just naming the stone itself rather than trying to save the Bible, but the naming the issue. So my last question for you, maybe in a short way. What was your one of the best or worst teaching experiences that became the most transformative experience for you? I know we all have some.
Well, I can say there are lots of experiences, but one of them is that when I first joined Iliff, Iliff was a very strange land because I was trained at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is very Presbyterian, and the sola scriptura which means only the Bible is the norm for preaching and for Christian life. But in my first class at Iliff, one student in my first class, one student raised the hand, and then she said, "Dr. Kim, I don't want to preach from the Bible." And then I said, "Oops, I've never ever heard that kind of statement." And then I asked her, "Would you please tell me then from what do you want to preach?" And then she said, "I'm going to preach from the newspaper, not from the Bible." And then I said, "Oh, okay. Then that's fine, but I'm gonna give you the interpretive process of the text. Then you may need to interpret the newspaper through my 7-step interpretation process." Anyway, she said, "Okay, I don't want to preach from the Bible." And then later I learned she was a UU at the time, but before she was a very conservative Christian church, Presbyterian church member. And then she was very hurt by the Bible. And then she said the Bible was the weapon to attack my spirits. And then I eventually left the church. So, well, I fully understand, what you said. And then I respected her experience, but eventually, she preached from the Bible, all 3 sermons in class, And then she said, "I did not know the Bible said such and such different things that I had learned." So there was one of the experiences that I felt first very frustrated, but eventually the student and another class members, classmates learned that the Bible is very, strange and very new and refresh when we approach, that from different angles and different perspectives.
Thank you. Carrie or Eric?
I could talk about just an ongoing challenge, which is how to help people practice spiritual care. So in the test class I'm going to give in a few minutes, but also in the courses now, we use our Zoom sessions to break up into small groups and have spiritual care conversations with each other. And this is part of like clinical learning, but it's not used as much in spiritual care. And then students record their conversations and then look through at whether they were able to use spiritual practices to calm themselves while they were providing care, and then what it was like to receive care. And it's what I've really enjoyed about this practice. And then my teaching assistants and I have spiritual care conversations with each other in front of the class, is just that creativity of learning through practice, and then the amazing opportunities of Zoom to video yourself and then see how your body language, your tone of voice aligns with your core values and beliefs. So it's a dynamic, it's a kind of really hands-on way to learn. It's also really hard, when you're recording, transcribing what you're doing spontaneously and then saying, "Oh, I was so anxious in that moment," but it makes teaching very lively.
Thank you, Carrie. Eric, one of the worst or one of the best?
This is both, I think. I teach a seminar on the book of Acts, and a couple years ago, we were in class, and it was a small class of maybe 6 or 8 people. And there was one person in the class who was from a very conservative, traditional Christian background, and a few people in the class who were not, and a bunch of other people in the middle. And we came to some of the parts of Acts where there are exorcisms of spirits or demons. And it was interesting how in that moment, you know, there's just a real diversity of experience, what people bring to the text. We had some people saying, well, that's of course, you know, hocus pocus. It's make-believe stuff that these ancient people wrote down. And we had one person saying, I've seen that, we've done that, we do that in my church. That's a practice that we have. You know, so I can tell you how it works if you want to know. And these two perspectives coming into contact with each other felt in the moment kind of like handling dynamite. But in the end, I think it came to a place of like mutual informing and mutual understanding, where people were able to understand their own perspective through understanding the perspective of someone else. And at the end of the day, it felt really good, that conversation. So those are the kinds of conversations I really value in the work that we do.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. So I'd like to give a chance to students to ask questions. Any questions, from what you heard, or questions related to courses that my favorite colleagues teach? Okay, so the question from Adrian. It seems like Iliff attracts a very diverse population of students than other theological schools. What are the biggest advantages and disadvantages that this diverse community creates? Excitement. And the class is a lab of interreligious cultural respect and humility practice. But I think these colleagues can say more about them in concrete terms.
Well, it's a wonderful way to learn spiritual care. We had Mormon military chaplains seeking education at Iliff because they were not discriminated against. And so when you have a class, the class I just taught on sexuality, which can have people who are pagan or Wiccan, Unitarian Universalists, humanist chaplains, Mormon military chaplains, you get this wonderful conversation around how our moral foundations orient us to issues around sexuality and our beliefs. And what I found is that when there are differences in moral foundations, like between valuing religious authority and loyalty to one's religious tradition and ethnic group, in contrast, say, to a student who really values the moral foundation of liberty, that in spiritual care, the overarching value of care, do no harm, unites us together in thinking about when are aspects of sexuality life-giving and when are they life-limiting. So I think it just really deepens the way we're able to listen interreligiously to each other.
Thank you. Other perspectives or answers? Yeah, and also there is a other question and answer going on in the chat room between Dr. Kim and Unji, and admissions about Bible in one hand and the newspaper the other, and what Karl Barth said. And also I when I taught the post-colonial decolonizing Bible studies class a few years ago, I had a student who is a Buddhist, who is not even Christian, and agnostic, and also a Christian, all in the same class about how to teach the Bible from post-colonial perspective in the class. And we had a student who is very progressive otherwise, but accept the sexuality, gender identity issues. So I think having that heated debate really is giving, opening up to understand, to see what in real life ministry context that we will run into in rather than, because we are not going to have people who only agree with our perspectives in our work. So I think in that sense, I think our classroom with this such diversity becomes really the lab that we, also how we learn to engage with the people who have a very different opinions and still be a care provider and the spiritual leader for those communities. So I think our time is up. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you so much for your time, and also you're always such a care oriented teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Lee. Thank you for moderating the panel, and thank you, as always, for your brilliant presence. But we'll see you soon. Enjoy.